would say, for me, is research. And what you're doing essentially is that there is a lot of information out there, but I guess your responsibility as a subject is to bring something of your own to it, whether this is new in a traditional sense, or whether that's just reinterpreting the old to give it your own touch. I guess that I would call also research, because it's sort of reinventing how you look at what's already there, or perhaps making others realize the value of what was there, and perhaps reiterating that value. So I guess that for me is how my idea of research has changed.
I would just add, yeah, like a lot of what we were doing in our project involved personal essay writing. So like we all kind of took, like the original inspiration was from our own life experiences, and I don't think I wouldn't have thought of that as being a part of the research project before. I thought it had to be something like you're always going to somewhere else, and like I come from an anthropology background, which is very like, I mean, there are lots of problems with it too, in like the colonial background of like going to the other, which is like so messed up. But that was kind of like what I had been taught research was. So to come from like looking at our own communities was a really interesting look, and I think actually also helped me deal with some of the like issues I had with my own discipline, which is anthropology, of like maybe it's less problematic when you're looking at your own community, because you don't have to go and look at the other and like tell the other what their life is. Like you can look at your own community and like find new things by like taking in like scholarship and research that you're doing and applying it to something that you've already experienced, but with a new lens, like with an academic.
Maybe we'll give one last question to Glenn. If
sure. I was very interested in the fact that you worked as groups of 5. So I wondered whether one of you could talk a little bit about how did you learn to work as a group, and how did you think through the obvious tensions that arise when you're working in a group dealing with research?
I'll just say a brief note, a brief optimistic note. I think that like our group of students maybe have had like difficult and strained group experiences in the past, because there are not often students just like us in terms of what we want to achieve and like ambition or quality of work. And so for me at least, it was like incredibly inspiring that like these are a collected group of people who are those people in groups previous to that. So I found that kind of squashed those sort of like anticipated tensions with like who's leading the group, who's doing most of the work. Like it was, everyone was equally keen to do work, and
yeah, that is really true, because in a way, just because these were a selected group of students, we were all equals, and I never felt that, like I was every day constantly blown away by the work that my peers were doing, that I was inspired by them, and they said the same for other students as well. So it was never in terms of competition, but just learning from each other, and I think we started out as a group, but at the end we emerged as a team. So that transition over the month has been revolutionary, and for the first time I've enjoyed myself in a group project.
And I think just to briefly finish that is in our group, none of us studied anything remotely similar to what anyone else was studying, and so by very nature of that, the way in which we looked at what we were looking was going to greatly differ, and so there was no way for me to compete against any other person in my group, or one way for me to say, oh, well, your analysis of this estrogen story is incorrect, because it's not. Everyone has a different way of looking, and so in that respect, we were all on an equal playing field, because we were all experts in some regard, as needed, we needed one another as much as the professor needed us. So it was very, we all just in this big circle relied on one another, I guess.
Ahmed, last word?
Yeah. So no, for me the experience was, I guess, somewhat different, because I mean, as far as the problem that we were examining was concerned, I still have fundamental disagreements with a lot of the members of my group, and we used to have long debates about them. It was very hotly contested as to which interpretation of a particular event, a particular criticism of this play was sort of more, I guess, was going to contribute more to the narrative that we were trying to create of the Cultural Revolution. And I mean, we still have fundamental disagreements amongst us. I have disagreements with our professor about how to interpret certain historical events. they were never resolved, but that didn't get in the way of us working together and sort of having this lively debate of ideas about how we should read history.
So I think it's time for the coffee break, and we can continue there, but I think what we've heard is, I think, and I hope, a pretty good reflection of the diversity, the teamwork, the level of scholarship, and the reflection on the research process that characterizes scholars in residence. So thank you all for coming and listening, and thank you, scholars.
Thank you.
So that's where I am. And then when I think I sit here and I see you Right.
That's definitely.
Fight.
I can technically learn.
I've been here for 5 years, actually. An administrative. Yeah, really do. So it's like. Thanks so much.
You have my email. Bill, let me know. Because I think we kind of crossed things. We're going to be doing some involved.
And there were so many type A's in one place that we all just yelled. None of us knew each other at that point, but we all just yelled over each other.
Because we had some students who first year, I don't know what happened. Just like, well, there you go. No, it's interesting. It's the one thing that we collectively realized, one thing that we realized was that this is something that people didn't think a lot about. It's an unnamed factor. It doesn't have a and so, during my interview specifically, when I was
That was positive.
things would pop up down the road. You would talk for an hour about random things, and suddenly there'd be a story. I mean, these things are just one thing that's
Would you mind giving me one year when we're going to have
yes.
But there's many more stuff.
I know.
I'm not sure exactly, but there's definitely an aspect to that, yeah.
A very good place for you to go, and it's not far from the Lincoln Park. The Toronto Vegetarian Association offices is down on, the address is India. It's down on
For me, it's so
Baldwin's Street. So they're actually on the upstairs of the vegetarian haven.
No, it's just coffee.
They're they have a lot of historical, early, and
I want pictures.
the Toronto Vegetarian is the second oldest vegetarian association.
Check 1 2 test test check. Mic 3 test test.
Toronto was second, started in 1940 as an association.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
Check mic 2 test test check check.
Every time the download comes up with
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Oh, I have the brandy. Oh, really?
Check mic 1 mic 1 check check test mic 1 mic 1.
And if you want to
He is a
read,
slacker.
just go into the vegetarian haven.
I worked with him for a month. Really good. It went by so fast. We all like said our short piece, and then she was like, "Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions." And I was like, "What?
Here.
We just started."
I'm going to give you my contact info. That's my email. I can have a whole lot of info on the chemicals that mimic estrogen.
I'm always so impressed by hearing everyone else. I'm like, wow, you guys sound so fancy.
Don't hesitate to contact you. You'll find out some stuff that will blow your head off. I am really surprised. And after I send you some of the material, there's a few things you will do. One, if you're not vegetarian, you will go vegetarian. Okay? You won't eat no more junk foods. And you'll be very careful how you eat. Same thing with lotions and chemicals. You find out a lot of stuff about alcohol is one of the biggest factors. Drinking.
That is on John.
In fact, that is one of the reasons.
Yeah, they're muted.
Some of the guys
Just don't drop them, please.
why the males are turning into female. And part of it is mimicking of the estrogen. It's caused from living bad, lousy life. You drink junk food, fries, you drink the soda, you drink the Coke, and that's it. And you're loading yourself up with this
Wait, can you get the
compound that is synthetic and mimics
whole audience?
And the same
I'm gonna
thing
look like
happens with women. And they'll say,
Hey.
I'm a lesbian.
Jonathan really wants a picture.
One, bad eating habits.
Oh, almond.
These toxic
Oh, almond.
substances,
Yeah.
meat, and lack of exercise. Good exercise for both male and female helps flush out that compound. And instead of making excuses.
Okay. Well, I'll send her along your email for sure. I'm sure she'll be very happy with
Your
it.
eyes. Your eyes are like dirty.
And here, and this will help you.
Are you okay? Almond and Jonathan. That's fine.
You know, but
I will, I'll definitely send this on to our team.
contact me and I said environmental health.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get excited to start it.
Yeah. Exactly. The mic is tied to the podium.
Otherwise you get rushed to spam.
We could all be looking at the same chair.
Just checking.
Like we're all receiving a question. Does that make sense? Yeah, I know.
Did I give you two?
Yeah, I have another one over there.
Contact me. I have some stuff that will blow your head off. I mean, it'll blow your mind.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Do the mics need to be switched on and off
Good day.
when you get to that stage?
I
Or you do that?
taking care of that, yeah.
Didn't carry us
So
We're
Ahmed,
extra.
I think if we all look at the same chair, it will look
Okay.
like we're all anticipating a question. Okay, so I'm thinking like not this chair, like this, you think about one back.
The one back.
Like there's
So-
just a full crowd.
Yeah, her husband did.
This is so great.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, guys, let's
Good
get some
work.
coffee. Wanna go and sleep?
No, the panel discussion is here after the coffee break, is it not? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's here? I thought it was.
I think they're going a little longer for the coffee break because the sessions took a little longer. Us students, you know, we just talked so much.
Well, isn't that great that we did? Yeah. Yeah, she is.
Oh, okay. Right, okay.
Yeah, I just walked over with her. Well, that's why Suzanne was so
Right, so let's start, so
Yeah. No, it's because they're running late.
Yeah.
I just walked over with the chair who was of the next session was very relaxed. And I thought, if I see you within 5 minutes, I better stop talking to you.
So shaken.
Enjoy your day.
Yeah. Do we? I don't know. Yeah, so those are the. Who would be worth? Okay, if they're interested. She's interested in reading, and she's, you know, when nobody was looking for students.
So this, it looks like this, it's interesting, so it looks like JHI has two student engagement things. One is year one, and one is this thing, which apparently is 1 month long.
Yeah.
And, yeah, and it includes residents, like,
Oh, residents?
yeah, so they basically all, like colleges, it's sort of a partnership with, colleges. And, it's interesting, I was gonna ask a question, but I
Oh, is
guess
this
didn't
during
get a
the
chance.
summer?
It's 1 month
Oh,
in
I
May.
see.
And it was interesting because it made me think of, there was another discussion yesterday where the guy was saying, you know, multidisciplinary is great in the centers and stuff, but trying to get the department to support it because
Oh,
the
yes, was
silos
that the
within the
final
department.
speaker?
Yeah. So it's
Yeah,
interesting that
that was
their
interesting.
programs is partnership with the colleges and the JHI,
Yeah,
and they're saying, you know, it's great that it's interdisciplinary.
yeah.
And I wanted to ask, you know, like, is there any buy-in from the departments? Because that was the stumbling block, right? Like the,
Yeah.
um,
Well, and also, I mean, he was the yesterday. I'm looking at the
Michael
screen. Yes.
Rib-
Very,
Rib-
yeah. You know, this incredibly deeply interdisciplinary postdocs and ended up having trouble getting placed.
yeah, that's just, or that, I mean, I've certainly seen a job posting saying we want you to do everything, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but they don't necessarily want you in metallurgy as well as in visualism.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, and I
I
think,
don't know, what was the discussion like after?
we only got,
Not too
we
long.
only got 3 questions and, and I think,
We're keeners.
That's good, I like it. Could you yank that slide off for me?
Sure.
Thanks. Thanks.
That's interesting because he prefaced it.
So you guys are set or almost set? I think we can send people in. It's gonna take a while to bring them.
Sure. Do you know the second panelist, what he's planning on doing?
Right here, ask them.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
And the answer is no, I don't know.
Okay.
What you know from me?
Do you have any technical needs for your
No,
presentation?
absolutely no technical needs.
Perfect.
I prepared myself for humanities conference. Oh, was that,
And I was being so generous about the social stuff.
very
My
good, very
comments.
good. Well, I'm gonna take them apart. Oh.
So, these mics are currently
Sure.
on, so you won't have to push any buttons when the time comes to use them, but I have them muted so nothing will come through right now.
So how close do we hold them?
So make sure you hold them close to your face, more like an ice cream cone. And,
You're gonna speak from up there, right? And then, yeah. That's what I'll do.
Perfect.
If this is the audience, then I'll be more.
There you go. You might as well be relaxed.
Yeah. But also, actually, they did say that, she did ask how did that influence your actions, or, what did you get out of it?
So how long are you staying around?
I fly back tomorrow. I've got, it's tomorrow evening I fly back, so I've probably got half a day to.
To putter about it.
Yeah.
You've been here before, haven't you?
No.
Oh,
This is
wow.
my first time, so. But I had the weekend before, so I thought I can't come to Toronto for the first time ever and just fly into a lecture theatre and go back.
I understand. No, that's good.
So I went up the Seaton Tower just
Oh, okay, just to do the thing.
did I meant to go to the island, but they're closed for flooding.
Yes, yeah, it is,
So I
yeah.
did a harbour tour.
Sure.
So it seems good. Spent Sunday in the art museum, which I really
Very good.
enjoyed.
Very good. The Royal Ontario Museum is also pretty good.
That's tomorrow
Yeah.
night.
Very good. And it's just down the street.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
It's a good walking city. If you're here longer, there's lots of places
so
just to walk around.
their
Communities,
goal
what
is to
have
see
you.
if they can expand this to a stable number of 100 students.
Very well.
Do you both already have water, or should I get you some?
I'm fine.
I've got some water there, so I'm poised with the water. You've got my handout.
I do. You don't have a handout.
No, I don't. He's gonna do the main thing.
She did both sides, actually.
It wasn't a long question. Well, it was only two.
Say it's two sides. Can I take one? Yes, I can. I'll take one of the two sides.
I'll wait till people join us. And I'll introduce you both at the beginning. Is
That sounds
within the
fine.
That
That's
seems to
what,
be
that's
what's
what everyone's been
happening.
doing, so that's great. Introducing us to serious scholar and he is the other.
Yeah, it's
I'm just going to mention probably your 2012 book because that seems the most relevant.
That's fine, yeah.
we were actually
Long lists of articles and stuff.
I felt that the discussion here, in a different kind of context, I'd emphasize the other work, but
We could mention that what you're in, the Jackman Humanities local university. Yeah, you're in it.
That's really.
yeah, almost a two
That's a good point.
I think that would do well.
Oh,
So Suzanne,
I know what it is, mate. I know what it is. So it's the, I just, it'll happen, but we leave it. We just have it done.
my comments will be extensive.
It's you, I'm just gonna relate to it.
no, no.
yeah, that's the one I was going to mention, 2012.
Oh, that one, sorry,
Yeah.
yeah, oh, I thought you meant the one on the, amendment influential culture. But no, that, just mention that one. Yeah, that's yes, yes, exactly. No, sorry, I thought, like, when you say 2012, I think of the medievalist concept.
Probably have too many books. You mixing up the titles. I could do
Yes, you can do if you like. But,
Short is okay?
yeah, short is okay.
I think we should start.
Good morning. I'm Suzanne Akbari, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the last of our sessions in this amazing two-day conference. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers at the outset, ask each of them to deliver their remarks, and then we'll have a shared discussion. And Bob has informed me we need to stop at 11:45 sharp, so I will be keeping time in a diligent way. Our first speaker, Ian Way, is Senior Lecturer in Medieval European History at the University of Bristol. His research explores the role of intellectuals in medieval society, especially the authority and status of the Masters of Theology at the University of Paris in the late 13th century. He writes about the different ways of knowing developed by learned men and women in various social contexts and the political and social views that they put forward, especially with regard to money, sex, and politics, as in his 2016 article that came out in a collection from Brussels. The one piece of his extensive list of publications that I want to highlight today is a volume that he published in 2012 on the global university, past, present, and future perspectives. One of the things I find most interesting about Ian's work is the extent to which he brings a very deep historical perspective to thinking about what the university might be today, and so I'm really excited about this. He's been coordinating a collaborative project called Ideas in University for the Worldwide Universities Network. Our second speaker, Glenn Jones, will be familiar to many of you as Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE. He holds an Ontario Research Chair in Post-Secondary Policy and Measurement, and his research focuses on university governance. His most recent books are Governance of Higher Education, Global Perspectives, Theories and Practices, and Universities and Regional Development, a critical assessment of tensions and contradictions. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming the first of our two speakers.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and many thanks to you, Bob, and to the Jackman Humanities Institute for inviting me. It's very kind of you indeed. I open with the proposition that intellectuals in the humanities and social sciences have distinctive contributions to make to discussions of the future of universities, and indeed a responsibility to make them. I say this because our disciplines, various as they are, equip us to compare institutions of higher learning in different periods and cultures, and to analyse both how they work as institutions and the language or discourses that we use to talk about them. And this in turn permits us to identify what is particular to universities in the present and perhaps to suggest possible ways forward. I'm going to begin by discussing the University of Paris in the 13th century and the way in which it engaged with many publics. Not because I think straightforward lessons can be learned, but in order to suggest what we might value now and what we perhaps lack. I'm going to argue that in the 13th century, the new university's success was based on a combination of flexibility and stability. Institutionally, an apparently dysfunctional structure permitted many external parties to claim a stake in the institution, while a secure career pattern and a powerful discourse of negotiation established a strong and lasting core identity. Then I'm going to suggest very briefly that contemporary universities often seem to take a very one-dimensional approach to their structures and the accommodation of interests of what we now call stakeholders. I'll spend a little longer suggesting that current discourses used in negotiations between universities and stakeholders are extremely shallow and unlikely to empower universities in those negotiations. My analysis of contemporary universities will be brief and suggestive because after Glenn's contribution, I hope that you will discuss what words and phrases currently used in and about universities you find either inspiring or utterly exasperating. I should say that I don't want to trigger a series of moans and laments. Scholars in the humanities, I think, are too often cast in the role of critics who can't solve the problems that they identify, and so we end up being dismissed as whingers and moaners, and sometimes that's exactly what we deserve. So, if we're dissatisfied, what exactly are we unhappy about, and what should be done instead? If we're happy, well, what is it that makes us happy, and why can't there be more of it? So, if you all have the handout, I'm moving to part B on that handout. So, the University of Paris emerged at the end of the 12th century, and it took shape during the 13th century. And I want to highlight the complexity of the institution that emerged, and to suggest that its authority was based on a capacity to respond flexibly to external pressures while maintaining a strong overarching sense of identity. So let me begin with the university as a complex community of communities. So this is the first section in part B. So if we examine the occasions when formal privileges were granted, it's clear that the students and the masters of Paris were frequently treated as a single community, and that they were capable of taking collective action. So, in a sense, the whole university was a single community. But that community was made up of many other communities, some with very particular senses of identity. So let me run through them. They're actually listed on the plan, so it should be easy to follow. A student joined the university by submitting to a particular master who accepted responsibility for him. So at the very lowest level, the university was composed of masters, each with a number of individual students clustered around him. The masters were then organised into faculties. The Faculty of Arts was the first to develop, so its status as a legal corporation with an elected rector at its head was well established by the middle of the 13th century. The masters teaching theology, canon law, and medicine remained informal groupings until the second half of the century, when they too produced written statutes, got a seal, and elected officers. The faculty structure was divided and very considerably complicated by the nations. The Masters of Arts divided themselves into 4 nations, with arts students gaining affiliation by association with their masters. And the 4 nations were France, Picardy, Normandy, and England. And each was a very rough and somewhat arbitrary geographical grouping. And each was a distinct and largely autonomous corporation with its own assembly, seal, statutes, financial arrangements, and so on. And the nations organised teaching, the religious life of its members. They employed messengers to go between the university and wherever their students came from, and they arranged banking facilities for their students. So, unsurprisingly, many masters and students felt an overwhelming sense of loyalty to their nation. And throughout the 13th century, there were conflicts between the nations, some of them extremely violent, so we're talking about fighting in the streets. And in many respects, the nations shaped the everyday lives of the majority of masters and students, and the arts faculty constituted perhaps 2/3 of the university. It would, however, be an oversimplification simply to say that the university was composed of faculties with the Faculty of Arts divided into 4 nations. It was actually a significant measure of interpenetration or overlap between the faculties. So many students and bachelors in the higher faculties were also Masters of Arts. That's to say, they taught as Masters in the Arts faculty in the morning, and then they attended classes in theology or law or medicine in the afternoon. And until they became Masters in these higher faculties, they remained members of their nations in the Faculty of Arts, subject to their jurisdiction and active participants in their governmental processes. Furthermore, before they could become bachelors, students in the Faculty of Arts had to swear obedience to the rector, whatever their future position might be. So many students and masters in the higher faculties were therefore bound to the rector of the Faculty of Arts by this oath. Within, and sometimes cutting across the structure of faculties and nations, were a growing number of colleges. The earliest were simple charitable foundations. They just provided some accommodation and small financial grants for poor students. Some were defined by subject, so they only admitted people studying a particular subject. Some only admitted scholars from a particular region. But some of the later colleges were highly complex institutions. So the Sorbonne in particular regulated the lives of its members in great detail and required them to participate in its management by holding offices in turn. And it supported their studies, ran extra classes, provided a library, and so on. So while most students weren't in colleges, they just rented houses or boarded with masters or just lodged with townspeople, for a few, the colleges provided essential support and really dominated their domestic and scholarly lives. A much more challenging degree of complexity was presented by the growing involvement of the friars and other religious orders within the university. Neither the Dominicans nor the Franciscans permitted their members to study or teach in the Faculty of Arts. They came to study theology. And at first, the rest of the university was fine with this and made them very welcome, and the friars were taught by secular masters of theology. By secular, I don't mean lay status. They had clerical status, but they were not members of religious orders. But the friars were not fully tied into the emerging structure of the university. As I said, they didn't allow their members to study or teach in the Faculty of Arts. And unless a friar had been a Master of Arts before converting, he had not taken the oath to obey the university statutes that Masters of Arts took when they became masters. So they hadn't, unless they had converted from having been Masters of Arts, they hadn't promised to obey the statutes. And as the structure emerged, and as the university asserted itself, these anomalies really began to matter. And a critical point was reached in 1229 when the university went on strike. It began with a dispute over a bill in a bar. Some students thought they were being overcharged. The dispute led to the students breaking up the bar. The barman got his friends, went and attacked the students. The brawling was such that the Royal Provost got involved, and the Royal Provost's men killed some students. At this point, all the masters and all the students said redress had to be made. It wasn't made, so they went on strike, and very many of them left to study elsewhere. But not the friars. The friars refused to suspend their studies and even opened their schools to anyone, even secular students, who wished to continue their studies in Paris. Moreover, a guy called Roland of Cremona was granted the first Dominican chair in theology. And after the masters and students returned in 1231, the Dominicans kept that chair, and the mendicant schools remained open to secular students. And tension mounted thereafter not only because the friars clearly couldn't be relied on to back a strike, but also because their success was damaging the careers of the secular masters. Basically, they were attracting growing numbers of students, thus reducing the income received by the secular masters of theology. Moreover, by converting secular masters, they got 2 more chairs. And the resentment felt by the secular scholars was soon combined with the sense of grievance felt more widely by the secular clergy in France, whose authority and income was diminished when friars, backed by successive popes, preached, heard confession, and received pious donations from the laity. And long-standing resentment turned into bitter conflict in the 1250s and repeatedly thereafter. It was really impossible to escape from the problems caused by the friars and by members of other religious orders who wanted to be part of the university and yet also to retain their identity as members of wider religious communities. The secular students and masters were definitely not, however, pure members of the university, unconnected with the wider world. On the contrary, their need for financial support constantly reminded them of the groups to which they belonged outside the university. The cost of university education was high, and it probably increased during the century. Lots of scholars depended on their families for money and material assistance. Another source of income was holding ecclesiastical benefices. And lots of scholars, therefore, held offices in churches outside Paris, and despite the fact that they were non-resident, they weren't actually in those churches, they were drawn into the local politics of the communities where they held those livings. Financial support was also provided by wealthy patrons. Now, while the patrons may have been primarily motivated by charity, the recipients of their generosity were bound to feel informal ties of obligation and to be drawn into the political, regional or ecclesiastical networks through which this patronage operated. So scholars had ties of obligation to a variety of external groups and were drawn into their political worlds. There was another important respect in which students and masters looked beyond the university to a wider world. Very few scholars spent their entire lives at university. Most studied for only a few years and didn't get a degree. Only a tiny minority went on to teach as masters, and many masters only taught for a few years. Even those who had long teaching careers usually left well before the end of their working lives. So where did they go? Some went up to take up teaching posts elsewhere, but most worked in secular and ecclesiastical government. And this career pattern meant that the university had many alumni, some of whom were extremely powerful. And there were frequent contacts between the university and its former members, and occasions when alumni looked to the university for support. So one occasion, an archbishop said to the masters of Paris, what we are, you will be. And so you should politically declare your support for us in a row with the Pope. And many men were attracted to the university precisely because of the career opportunities that they expected or hoped to be on offer as a result. The university was always fundamentally outward-looking, and university men were aware of their future interests. So to sum this section up, the university was an extremely complex community of communities, offering masters and students a range of identities. The key point I would make is that being a member of the university meant very different things for different men. Now, unsurprisingly, in view of this very messy structure, the university environment was at times highly volatile. There were moments of conflict and instability when individuals had to decide where their loyalties lay. when nation fell out with nation, when secular clerics felt threatened by the friars, or when students simply brawled with the townspeople, to give a few of the most common and frequent examples. Now, traditional accounts of the university, looking at this, have just seen conflict. We might, however, see this as a kind of flexibility. An apparently dysfunctional structure permitted many external parties to claim a stake in the institution. No one was effectively shut out. But something had to hold the institution together and give it stability. And here I want to stress the emergence of a strong core identity. So this is my second section in this part, if you're following the plan. There was an overriding sense of shared identity that provided some stability and made the university a permanent locus of authority. And I want to stress two aspects to this. First, the stabilisation of the academic career was crucial. In the schools of the 12th century, ambitious students made their careers by attacking their masters and stealing their students. This is the world of Peter Abelard. Basically, if you were young, ambitious, you attended so-and-so's lectures, and then when you felt you were ready, you simply said, well, I'm teaching now, I'm teaching next door, I've got something to say that he hasn't, and hope that the other students would come to you. In the 13th century university, students undertook programs of study which, if they chose to complete them and if they did so successfully, led to the award of degrees. And the degree qualified the master to teach, and he was obliged to do so for a minimum period, so the system perpetuated itself, turning the most successful students into masters through a systematic process of scholarly formation. So masters, rather than students, now had control. Students advanced their careers in the 13th century not by competing with their masters, but by competing with each other, largely for the approval of their masters. And they accepted the authority of the masters because they hoped to wield the same authority when their turn came. And the time it took to gain academic credibility was essential. The 12th century student felt that he was ready to assume magisterial status so quickly that he could rival his master. And the master had no means of restraining him and no real power to offer eventual reward. The 13th century student was slowed down by the structured curriculum and the need to overcome a series of obstacles that led to degrees. And the master could make him wait as he went through that sequence of stages before eventually enjoying magisterial status in the next academic generation. And this relationship between students and masters, this career pattern, provided stability within the university. Second, the university developed an effective discourse of negotiation with those outside the university whose support they needed. I want to quote the opening of the papal bull Parens Scientiarum, Parent of Sciences. This was the bull of 1231, in which Pope Gregory IX granted key privileges. And I referred earlier to the strike that began in 1229. The Pope was absolutely livid with the Bishop of Paris, with the papal legate, with the crown. He just couldn't believe that this had happened, and it took him 2 years to get the students and masters back to Paris. And this bull marked the re-establishment of the university, the ending of the strike. The opening of the bull is on the handout. Paris, parent of sciences, like another carrieth zephyr, city of letters, and precious shines forth. It's great indeed, but concerning itself raises hopes for greater things that are pleasing to those who teach and those who learn. Where, surely as if in wisdom's special workshop, there is a mine for silver and a place for gold which they refine. from which those prudent in mystical eloquence, stamping ornaments of gold studded with silver and making necklaces elaborately, adorn and make beautiful the bride of Christ with precious stones, or rather stones beyond price. There iron is taken out of the earth, because when its earthly fragility is solidified by firmness, from it is made the breastplate of faith, the sword of the Spirit, and other armour of Christian soldiery, potent against the aerial powers. And copper is smelted from the ore, because while stony hearts burn, blown on by the fervour of the Holy Spirit, they take fire, and then actually the Latin can be read two ways. It could mean, and are made to proclaim the praises of Christ with resonant preaching, or it could mean, and by preaching are made resonant, proclaiming the praises of Christ. Now, note the use of Job amongst the embedded quotations. They're perhaps the most important quotations because the whole passage is modelled on a passage from Gregory the Great's Moralia in Job. So what message was the bull conveying right at the start? Well, in general, the university was associated with wisdom and support for the church. But things get more complicated with that final line. Read one way, those who studied at the university were transformed by the Holy Spirit to become preachers. Read another way, they were transformed by preaching as well as the Holy Spirit. Now, I think the primary meaning is that they were transformed into preachers, because the passage in Gregory's Moralia in Job is very clearly about men being transformed into preachers. So Parens Scientiarum invoked an authoritative and much more substantial vision of men being changed to become preachers. So the opening of this bull offered a strong statement of the transformative power of the university, specifically the power to produce preachers. Not everyone shared this ideal. Most students didn't go to university to become preachers. But this public vision mattered a great deal. First, it offered a set of values in which many university men, including those in leadership roles, sincerely believed, which many actively sought to implement, and which everyone understood and generally respected, even if they themselves had other priorities. So it was genuinely meaningful within the university. Second, it was publicly elaborated when secular and religious authorities gave their backing, their support to the university. Those who supported the university either genuinely believed in its pastoral mission, or they had to be seen to believe in it. I think it's rather like the discourse of excellence. Once someone invokes it, it's very hard to say, no, I've always been for mediocrity myself. Once they said it was of a pastoral mission, people either believed it or they had to go along with it. You couldn't counter that. So it offered a discourse through which to negotiate effectively with those who held power outside the university. So to conclude this part, the new university's success was based on a particular combination of instability and stability. Institutionally, an apparently dysfunctional structure gave it flexibility, permitting many external parties to claim a stake in the institution, while a secure career pattern and a powerful discourse of negotiation established a strong and lasting core identity, giving it stability and permanence. Theorists of our own day have talked about successful organisations combining stability and fluidity in response to rapid change. And they've coined the term adaptive instability. Well, the authority of the University of Paris in the 13th century was constructed in just that way. If we turn to universities today, so this is part C on the plan, might this analysis of a medieval university help us to frame useful questions and maybe even come up with some answers? Well, I'll only offer just one brief reflection on structure and governance. In universities in the UK, as I'm sure many of you know, democracy has been largely replaced by consultation and audit. So to give a specific example, in my own university, the board of the Faculty of Arts used to include all academic staff, all of us, and we took votes. And if we voted, the dean had to do what we voted for. Now that board consists only of those who hold key management roles to which they've been appointed from above after consultation. At the same time, the Research Excellence Framework, the mechanism by which the state distributes research funding, the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, assesses departments on the impact that they make. What impact? Well, the UK Research Council define it as, I quote, the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. Now, because this has implications for funding, so the kind of grading you get in this exercise determines the share of the total funding available that you get, because this has implications for funding, every department's impact strategy is intensely scrutinised and managed. But if the aim is to make universities engage with and contribute more to the world around them, I do wonder if more open structures and more willingness to countenance internal differences, dissent even, or what Eve yesterday called healthy antagonisms, might that not serve us better? Well, I just raised that as a question. I really want to focus a bit more on discourses of negotiation. The words used and the ideas in play when universities interact with those whose support they need. Now, I'm focusing here partly because I think we in the humanities have more expertise to offer here, partly because it's easier for all of us to do something about the language used in and about universities, and partly and selfishly because I'm keen to set up a collaborative research project on this matter. Now, if we think about discourses of negotiation, the contrast between the medieval University of Paris and universities in the UK today is very striking. When the British state sets out the terms on which it will fund universities, it does so in a language that is meaningless to many who work in universities and or alienates them profoundly. I'll just give one example. It's from a white paper published by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills in May 2016. And if you weren't aware of it, higher education falls within the remit of the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. And the white paper is called Success as a Knowledge Economy, Teaching Excellence, Social Mobility and Student Choice. And I will quote just one bullet point. It gives you the flavour of the whole thing. The bullet point reads, it simply declares, competition between providers in any market incentivises them to raise their game, offering consumers a greater choice of more innovative and better quality products and services at lower cost. Higher education is no exception. There is just so much with which one might take issue. It's not even clear that the title makes sense. Success as a knowledge economy. I don't know what that means. I'll avoid picking out all the other words that make me furious. But the point is that when university leaders respond in terms that the state will accept, they lose the support of those whom they claim to lead. And of course, to negotiate on someone else's terms is always to lose. And the result is that most academics are powerless to shape the direction taken by their universities, and many feel a sense of disenchantment that undermines every aspect of what universities seek to achieve. It's not like that everywhere, though. Glenn and I, when we worked on a Worldwide Universities Network project together, we attended several conferences in China. And in China, a very different dynamic seems to operate. I suppose it's about 10 years ago, we heard Chinese academics talking about the idea of the Asian university. And then more recently, it seems to have cropped up in speeches given by Chinese university presidents. So what is this Asian idea of the university? Well, they argue that Western universities have become neoliberal and have no values. Asian universities, however, have values that can be traced back to Confucius, and they therefore have something to offer students that Western universities do not. So, instead of Asian students going to the West, the prevailing pattern for over a century, Western students should come to study in the East. This discourse brilliantly captures the moral high ground while also staking a market position. Furthermore, it provides a vigorous rejection of past colonial domination. And with this as the prevailing source, Chinese universities have benefited from massive state investment. Coming back to where I work, I can't actually change British government policy on my own. I'll be racing back to vote from here, but I can't actually single-handed change government policy. So let me start with myself. Do I know how I want to talk about universities? Well, there's a fascinating project being run in Cambridge called the University Keywords Project. And they're using big data techniques to identify words and phrases that are being used less often and those that are being used more often in connection with universities. And their corpora, what they're searching, include the Internet Archive, papers of the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, and the Times newspaper. And they very kindly invited me to a seminar to discuss their work. And all the participants were asked to choose a word that they found in some way interesting and on which they wanted to comment. And I decided it was pointless to choose something that would set me off on a familiar rant about the commercialisation of higher education, the neoliberal university and so on. Just so much has been written and said about that. So I chose a word that I found infuriating, but I wasn't sure why. And it was journey. Often as in learning journey. And my hostility to this, because it made me feel vaguely ill, it puzzled me. So what's wrong with the metaphor of travel in education? I read and work on medieval ascents of the soul or the mind to God, and they often deploy the image of a journey. I tell students that they should find their own route through our curriculum, so I use the metaphor of travel. I was brought up in the 60s to see explorers not as agents of colonialism, but as noble, brave heroes, and it was precisely their journeys that were to be emulated. I looked for specific examples of the term being used in relation to higher education, and they were easy to find. So in Bristol, a course called Inquiry-Based Learning, Developing Your Learning Journey. An article, Autoethnographic Journeys in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education. A University of Bristol report, a roadmap for learning spaces for independent study. A Scottish report, Learning Journeys, Student Experiences in Further and Higher Education in Scotland. Now, the course and the article are the work of a Bristol colleague whom I've known for years, whom I respect hugely and like very much. I've really no criticism. The reports are full of jargon, but they have worthy goals. So why my irritation? Well, with a bit of further Googling, and I have to own up to appallingly casual empiricism here, but further Googling took me away from universities and into the world of reality TV. The Great British Bake Off. It's basically a baking competition, extremely popular. My sister and my niece have never forgiven me for declining the invitation to appear on the programme as an expert. It was a slightly bizarre phone call because someone said, "We're from Love Productions and we want to film you." And I repeated, "Love Productions, you want to film me?" And the students in the room fell about laughing, convinced I was being invited to be a porn star. But no, it's a baking competition, and every contestant has her or his bake-off journey. You can find it on websites, in magazines, and so on. The X Factor. I'm going to sound like a British High Court judge from the 1960s, but I believe it's a pop song competition. But you can always watch so-and-so's X Factor journey. And now I think I see what was making me grumpy. It often seems that we are seeking to be valued by people outside the university by identifying with common experience. Higher education is to be appreciated because it's familiar, because it's banal, just like everything everyone experiences. So much of the vocabulary that we're coming to use suggests that either we have no distinct purpose, let alone a higher purpose, or we're afraid to say it for fear of seeming elitist. Surely we have to get over this and find a way of talking about universities that captures beliefs and values shared within universities, expresses a distinctive purpose, and convinces people outside universities that they are worth supporting. So to finish, I've used my analysis of the University of Paris in the 13th century not to provide straightforward lessons for today, but as a heuristic device to identify a gap, one that we badly need to fill. And when we move to discussion, I'd very much like to hear what words and phrases exasperate you in connection with universities, but especially any that inspire you and might serve us in the way that the notion of transforming men into preachers served the medieval University of Paris. Thank you.
Good morning. Like others, I'd very much like to thank Bob and the team at the Jackman Humanities Institute. It's been a great pleasure collaborating on this event with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, the Jackman Humanities Institute. It's my model of perfect collaboration because, of course, Bob and his team did all the work. But it's been great fun, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I thank all of you for your participation in this. I'm speaking at a Humanities Conference, and of course, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, so I have actually quite extensive speaking notes, which I almost never do. And of course, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm almost always without. So this is, I've learned a lot from these 2 days. Have your notes, don't have your PowerPoints, and don't rely on other activities. I had a great opportunity to read Ian's comments in advance, and I really think that we're going to have a fascinating conversation about different ways of thinking about and discourse about the university. And I think he made some very fascinating observations drawing on the medieval university and the experience of the University of Paris in terms of issues of stability and flexibility and the importance of that in the context of the research university. I thought I would add a little bit to this conversation by talking about some different models and different ways of thinking about universities that we, those of us who look and study comparative studies in higher education are sort of view as standards or ways of thinking about some of these issues. I am a social scientist, I apologize for that, who studies higher education, especially higher education systems and policy and governance, and more recently academic work. But about 10 years ago, I just had a fascinating conversation with somebody who essentially was from a national organization in higher education, and obviously quite concerned about the emergence of teaching stream only positions that were emerging in several Canadian universities. And so it sort of raised the question, have you ever heard of this before? Have you ever heard of a situation where you have a professor who only teaches and doesn't really have research responsibilities? And I said yes, and I began to provide him with a huge list. And he was totally shocked. This is somebody who knows a lot about higher education. And he was shocked largely because his idea of the university was based on this assumption that research was a necessary function of the professoriate, and that research and teaching were intertwined, and that was the basis for the university as a model. And of course, those of us who study comparative higher education know that there is no single model of the university. So to some extent, I'm going to play with that simple notion. We frequently talk about the university as if it is a common institutional form. We write about the university, frequently projecting the form we know onto the less visible others. In organizational theory, one talks about organizational fields, the notion that there is an organizational field called a bank. We know what it does, and there are many reasons why those who run banks want to be identified as members of that common club, to be seen as paying attention to detail, to be viewed as safe and secure, to protect your money. And of course, banks look a lot alike, regardless of the country you are visiting. In the same way, there is an organizational field for universities, and individual institutions very much want to be seen as a member of that club. In some countries, becoming a member of the senior club of universities is an element of tremendous prestige, and you want to be seen as part of it. Even relatively new universities will frequently trace their ancestry to medieval Europe, and they'll adopt traditions and gowns and use quadrangles and other key elements to sort of signal that they are a member of the university club. But in reality, a range of quite distinct institutional forms of the university have emerged, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, often as a product of the rise of the nation state and the growing nationalism within Europe. The French higher education system that arose following the Revolution was very much designed to contribute to the French state. Research was largely the responsibility of the academies. The elite sector was the Grande École, initially specialized educational institutions focusing on science and engineering, but later expanding to include specializations institutions focusing on the social sciences and, in a much smaller degree, the humanities. The universities were far less selective, but these were the teaching institutions that offered a wide range of programs. The embarrassing defeat of the Prussian armies at the hands of Napoleon had led leaders in that country to conclude that education must have been part of the problem, and it certainly must be viewed as part of the solution. And Wilhelm von Humboldt very famously developed a plan for rethinking the entire educational system, but it was really his design of a new university in Berlin that would have the great impact. The University of Berlin would be the first modern research university, where faculty, organized under a chair system, were expected to engage in research and to teach students as part of the research process. Professors would be civil servants, operating under a social contract that provided them with the freedom to teach and explore new ideas, with job security protected by the state. Other models emerged in Russia, in Britain, both with Oxford and then later in the 19th century with the development of red brick civic universities, and of course there were other models in institutional forms in Italy and Spain and other parts of Southern Europe. These were quite different models of the university, each developed to fit the demands of the nation, but with quite different assumptions about the role of research, the role of the professoriate within these institutional structures. It was these national models that were largely exported through colonization. Grande écoles and heavily regulated universities would be found in the French colonies of Africa, while aspects of the British or Scottish university models could be found in North America, Australia, or parts of Africa. In the context of the Cold War, the Chinese model their post-revolution higher education system on the Russian, largely Soviet model. In the Canadian case, it was interesting to note that with a couple of very small, modest exceptions, universities only emerged following the American Revolution, and when many of those who fought on behalf of the Crown simply moved north. Escaping from the evils of the Republic, these were individuals who wanted to live under the Empire and were rewarded with land and British institutions. If you recall Eve Tuck's excellent presentation from yesterday, you'll see the significance of this new group of settlers, these United Empire loyalists, being rewarded with land that belonged to the First Nations, for their loyalty to the British colonizer. These settlers, who were sometimes characterized as more British than the British, viewed universities as key institutions of civility. and a number of King's colleges based on a colonial model that had emerged in New York began to emerge in what was to become Canada. My simple point here is that multiple models of the university emerged, models with different assumptions about teaching and research, different relationships with the state, different assumptions about the role of the professoriate, and these models were exported through colonization and in turn became colonizing institutions. In some cases, specific models were adopted voluntarily as countries sought to find a model of the university that would fit local needs and might be adapted to the socio-political context of the jurisdiction. So there was no the university. There were multiple university models. There were very different university ideas. And perhaps more importantly for this conversation, there were two other key differences among these models. First, they had different publics. In return to the topic of this panel, in some cases the public was defined quite narrowly to focus primarily on the relationship between the university and the state. In others, the public was defined very, very broadly in both stakeholder and spatial terms. For example, with the creation of the land-grant universities in the United States under the Moral Acts of the 19th century, the federal government gave land for the development of state universities to support the needs of the settlers, land to support an institution that would support those who had settled on the land. Thinking back to Eve's presentation yesterday, a particularly innovative, layered form of colonization. Universities like Wisconsin developed programs in agriculture and engineering and viewed their role as our campus, the state, perhaps the broadest possible definition of publics. The Wisconsin model heavily influenced universities in Canada's West, as universities were created to serve the new settlers in the new provinces. The provincial universities in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba were quite distinct from those in the East. They moved quickly to develop faculties of agriculture, and they all had faculties of extension, units designed to extend the university into the community, to bring the knowledge and culture of the university to the town and to the farm. A few months ago, I spoke at a conference at Al Iqbal University in Islamabad, which takes great pride in being the world's second oldest open university, an institutional model with yet another understanding of the notion of publics. Created with support from the Open University UK, Allama Iqbal has 1.2 million students. And for many in the region, it is the only option for post-secondary education, especially for girls in rural areas. So different university models involve different understandings of publics. But the second key difference was that they positioned the humanities, I think, in somewhat different ways. And they seriously positioned research in the humanities in different ways. The humanities played a central role in the Russian and French universities, but research in the humanities did not, because research was under the umbrella of the Russian and French academies. This is changing, of course, as research is increasingly viewed as important in the universities in both systems, but these changes are still modest and gradual rather than revolutionary. The humanities were important to the German research universities, but they were positioned as less central within systems that valorize science and engineering and empirical research. They play an important role in the Chinese university, but humanities research in the current extremely conservative Chinese context must be pursued quite carefully. The humanities are taught, but seldom researched in the context of open universities. I actually think that a detailed comparative analysis of the role of the humanities, and particularly the role of humanities research in the context of different university models and systems, would be a quite fascinating project. So there is no the university, there are multiple universities with different assumptions about publics, about responsiveness, about stakeholders, about what's sometimes referred to as the third mission of the university. And there are differences in the role and positioning of the humanities, and particularly humanities research, in these different models and in these different systems. I've enjoyed this conference immensely, in part because this is not a common conversation. 20 years ago, when I attended higher education conferences in Canada and the United States, a significant component of the papers were from the humanities, especially history and philosophy. My understanding of higher education has clearly been shaped by my social science peers, but it has also been shaped by the historians who taught me about the evolution of higher education and the emergence of different institutional models, and by the philosophers who helped me understand the underlying assumptions about higher education in different systems. 20 years later, the conferences that I attend are almost entirely dominated by social scientists. I have no empirical evidence to back this up, But my strong impression is that the number of scholars from the humanities that focus their attention on universities and higher education has substantially diminished in the last few decades. Or the alternative explanation, there's simply two conversations. There is a humanities conversation about the university, and there's a social science conversation about the humanities, and the two never meet. I think this is quite a travesty, actually, because I think for those of us who are trying to understand the universities, we need the voices and perspectives of the humanities now more than ever. The university has never been more important to our humanity. It has never touched more people, influenced more lives, not always for the good, and yet receives so little attention by those who might help us understand its history, its present, and its possible futures. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit of time for questions and discussion.
You stymied them, Ian. You're wrong.
Can I start things off with a question that I think maybe both might respond to a bit? A little bit coming off of Ian's comments about how conflict within the universities might actually be understood in terms of a kind of a flexibility. It made me think a little bit about comparable phenomena in medieval culture, like David Nuremberg's work on violence in medieval Spain, or Chris Makovitz's work on rough tolerance in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. In other words, how violence can sometimes be deeply productive in certain kinds of settings. And this made me also think about some of the ways in which you were exploring, Glenn, what kind of creative disruption might exist within the universities. In other words, in a little less top-down way. I don't know if either of you might respond to that.
Oh, you would.
Yeah, well, I think the Nuremberg example would be a very good one for specifically the medieval context. I think thinking of, I'm not actually suggesting people should start fighting in the streets in universities, but I think it's what I would reject as often unhelpful is where everything is built around a mission statement and you cascade down through a series of strategy documents and plans, and everything neatly links on paper to everything else. But things that won't fit that plan just get pushed aside. And I think that, anyone who's been in any kind of leadership or management role, you realise you've got to deliver something at some point. Decisions have to be made. It's not that you want complete disorder, but I think sometimes we insist that everything fits an overarching plan far too quickly. And that's where I would say there is room for dissonance and discord.
There's a wonderful concept that's called organized anarchy that people often apply to universities, which I think is quite wonderful, right? There's a theoretical foundation for it. It's quite fascinating. But the basic notion is that universities are largely anarchical institutions. They sort of, but there's a facade of organization. So there is an organizational structure, but the reality is that many decisions are made in a certain way simply because somebody didn't show up to a meeting that day, right? That there is something about the way the decision process works inside university that's designed to look organized and structured, and it often simply isn't. But the university does a great job of telling the narrative as if it is. I think that in some systems, it's more than a narrative. In other words, there have been procedures and structures that have been created that really do take the university in a particular direction. But I think there are other systems where there is this facade of organization, and where the reality is that we tell a good story, even if the way we got there is the most non-linear, unstructured, disorganized way possible.
Thanks very much. That was, I really thought those were very powerful presentations. I want to ask about the narrative of decline of the university, because in both presentations there is a worry that as the university emerges as an institutional site in the modern world, that in some sense we face a decline of some form or the other. And I wondered what it might mean to think about the strategies by which one might arrive at a more affirmative narrative of the university. So I want to ask about the figure of the migrant. I mean, the subject of our political dispensation now is marked by the migrant in very, very fundamental ways. And I'm wondering, when one thinks about the emergence of the university has always been a space of hospitality, of receiving the migrant, of receiving difference, of constituting that difference in relation to what is already underway. So, I wonder whether there are other possibilities of thinking about the university through the figure of the migrant, but more precisely, I wondered also whether, we're not missing out on an opportunity of narrating the university through the prism of how it hosts concepts like freedom, emancipation, how in some ways, anti-colonial nationalism would not have been, in Africa at least, would have been impossible without the institutional site of the university. In fact, much of the generative ideas of the university found themselves in the kind of articulations of nationalism in the day. So I'm wondering whether, we're not missing out on an opportunity of returning to a more affirmative narrative of the university.
I think it depends a little bit on how we define that narrative. Well, that's the whole question. I've been doing a project with about 7 or 8 other people that focuses on what we're calling high participation systems. And so the starting point for the conversation is we now have quite a number of jurisdictions throughout the world, some developed, some not, where more than 50% of the population is attending some form of post-secondary education. The notion then is to go in and sort of say, well, having achieved that, how did they do it? And what are some of the propositions and ideas that we come across? And I think we have like 13 or 14 propositions that will come forward in the book project. But the notion, I think, is that what becomes core, I think, in this, if we talk about the university, is the notion of the research multiversity playing a central role in all of these systems. Now, in different degrees, because these are different arrangements and different systems. And so I think there is a narrative about how the universities have been quite successful in that institutional form. And if you think about what we've done as systems, I mean, we have very high percentages of our population now enrolling in an institution that 50 years ago might have enrolled 10 or 15%, and 100 years ago would have had almost no one attending. There was 1,500 post-secondary students in this country when it became a country. So there is a story about participation, about engagement, about contributing to the broader society, that's now can be told in a way that could never been told before. I mean, I do think that universities are viewed as pivotal in the knowledge economy and the knowledge society and on all of the things that we're talking about here. I think we have to be careful not to go too far with that, because I think the universities also have a history of racism, they have a history of selectivity, and they have a history of exclusion that we can't ignore. But I think there is a narrative about increasing participation, and that's a quite positive story about the ways in which universities have expanded and evolved within higher education systems.
Yeah, I mean, I like very much the story that you're starting to put at the forefront there. I mean, I find it's hard to think of universities in decline when I think of my own students or my young colleagues and the brilliant things they're doing. It's not in decline, it's just very frustrating that we have to tell stories that satisfy the British state and take us away from those fantastic things. I do like the idea of emphasizing migration. It's something that was at the heart of the medieval university. One of my favorite 12th century pieces about education was produced by Hugh of St. Victor, and he talked about how the scholar should feel that he was at home nowhere because of his intellectual distance from the immediate. I personally exist because my father came from China to do a PhD in Cambridge. So I think I do think that could be what I was saying. Well, we need to find a way of talking that works for us, and I do like that as a suggestion, actually. Yeah, it would be great.
Excuse me. When I grew up in the 1950s, there was a kind of simple mythos about school. 2 stages, primary and secondary, and then university, 2 stages. You don't actually want to hear. Never mind. Sorry. I was told this mythos growing up about 2 stages of school, primary and secondary, and then 2 stages of university, undergraduate and graduate. And I'm struck, as you say about numbers, not so many numbers went into the second of those, the university. I'm struck now that it seems to me there's sort of 3 stages, And I wonder whether we should think that what's happened is school has gone up, so it's now K to 16, and we have primary, secondary, and tertiary school, and then the things that I was told about the university are now more true of graduate school and postdocs. And so that therefore, when we think how the university is changing, would it be a productive, this is a slightly daft idea, but I'm just curious what you think. Would it be productive to think the university as having shifted forward 4 years, rather than staying in place and being really transformed by all kinds of new people in it and so on?
Hi, just before the mic leaves our territory over here, I thought maybe I could add another layer to a way we might think about this. I also know that scholars of color, indigenous scholars, black scholars, interpret the neoliberalization and the kind of downgrading of the work of the professoriate as coinciding with the increase of indigenous scholars, black scholars, into these various fields. And so the work becomes less valuable work as rising numbers of people of color are entering the academy, is another interpretation that I find quite compelling.
I mean, I think there's multiple ways of looking at this. One of the things we learn in looking at different higher education systems is that their arrangements are very, very distinctive. And in some systems, this is not our case, but in some systems, there's a kind of clear differentiation between that first sector, that's that sector that immediately follows secondary school, and then there's a notion of another sector that essentially provides graduate education at more senior levels. So different systems have essentially tried to accommodate that in different ways. Another variation on that theme is to recognize that the German universities, for example, are extremely elite. They continue to be quite elite, and that most students who do degrees in Germany do them in the Volksschule, which is really the kind of higher access, vocation, slightly more vocational, both vocational in the sense of moving into serious careers kind of graduate programming. We have a very different model because, and I think it's quite distinctive. It has a lot of parallels, I think, with the Australians. But the basic notion being that here you have one of the world's leading research universities. We say that, we probably believe it for the most part. But that university is built on top of a relatively high access undergraduate institution. So we have 60,000 undergraduate students. This is primarily from the GTA. This is not a sort of nationally attracting group here. A lot of international students. But the look of that undergraduate component is so different than what is above it. And I think so that the status, going back to Eve's concept of this, the status and the prestige and all the things that we talk about in terms of the research university are in that top component. That's not to suggest that that undergraduate education is not highly valued, but we look different. I mean, we look different than almost all the other institutions which are in the top 20 of any ranking you might want to take a look at because of the size of that undergraduate population and the fact that this university has tried to be responsive, I think, to both the demands of the local GTA and, of course, responsive in the sense of the money that's provided by the province for expansion. We're not alone because the other Canadian universities are pretty much in the same boat. UBC is the second greatest. Look how large it is. Look at York. Look at McMaster. Look at Alberta. And it's a different kind of institutional model. So I'm not answering all of those questions, but it is that sense that you know, if you want to talk about the participation in university level education, the reality is yes. The number of people graduating now from university is probably comparable to the number that graduated from high school 60 years ago or 70 years ago. But the way we've done that, I think, is quite distinctive in this province. And it has its pluses and its minuses. But it does mean that those undergraduates are in the same institution as the big research institution that it is. And I think there are advantages to that combination that don't show up where you have a very elite undergraduate student population that is often very selective and often racially defined.
I know this discussion could go on much longer, but I'm looking at the clock, and we're going to have closing remarks. But before we have our closing remarks, I wonder if we could thank our speakers one more time.
this will not serve as the last word. I think it's really a wonderful sort of conversation where when you get to the end, there's a lot more to be thought about and a lot more to be said and to be heard still. So I will just say it all now for the next few days while you sit here. No, my comments will be very short. First of all, I think one of the things that's been really deeply satisfying about this discussion is that it has been a humanities discussion from the beginning through to the end, even with the social scientist giving not only a nod to the humanities as valuable, but in fact doing humanistic work at the podium as well. And I think it's really extremely exciting to see the humanities represented in the discussion about universities. When we do come, we play a bit differently. So what is really important, I think, is to realize that the emphasis, the differences which we brought. For instance, the differences of place. This was not a discussion about the North Atlantic universities. This was a discussion that took place seriously, that as it were traveled around the world, and also disrupted this very place, the University of Toronto. It also took place in different historical times, somehow lodged in this problem of when the future is and when today is, but also historically inflected over the when is the future and what the future used to look like and how it doesn't look like that now, etc. So the times, the historical times matter a great deal. In addition, there was serious discussion about the challenge of technology, which is a challenge of today and tomorrow, but of course is a much older challenge too, and is a way in which the university is really in the world, which was part of our focus, and leads to my next to last point, which is in the strongest sense, the way we are in the world most of all is with our students. For our students are both in the world and in the university. And the chance to focus and to start thinking more seriously about how our higher education is going to be coping and exploring and taking great advantage of both the presence of the students in their world and in the university is one of the mandates, I would say, that waits us. And in the humanities, we have a special chance for that. My last comment is, it is in fact 10 years of the Jackman Humanities Institute, and I think this conference pulled together a series of aspects that really have been most valued at the Jackman Humanities Institute. And I think that the easy way of labeling those would be to say both the attention to the risk involved in research, the chance that we don't know what we're going to find, we don't know if we will find anything, we may only find the question, and similarly, a certain kind of exploration, not necessarily destined for developing new fields and settling questions, perhaps an exploration that unsettles us and makes us feel rather challenged not only in the old worlds but in the new worlds. So for all of that, I'm very grateful to the speakers. I think you've done an exceptional job. And to all of you who have listened and participated, I'm grateful to you for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And with that, we're concluded.
And it's worked its way through. It really didn't play much of a role at all in Eastern University. Some of them have taken it up. St. Francis Xavier, you've got some exceptions with some of but it wasn't part of it. Yes, I think it's, yeah, I think it's sort of, this notion of being relevant and being taken out of relevance shows that. And I think that underscores at least some of this notion that we have to somehow prove that we're part of communities and that we're not isolated. No, it's hard to thank you very much. Very good. Well, thank you very much for this. It's been a great conference. Let's see you guys tomorrow. So, sorry, I can't remember where we left.
No, I'm just saying, I'm curious about this part of humanities.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
you'll be at the reception.
Sorry, Jennifer. She's reading Lindsay Mann.
I just want to say thank you.
From the humanities.
We'll touch base.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We should have met. We should have met a long time ago. It's very
Always around the summer.
Yes. Please do.
I mean, there are parts of